And he says, oh, Muslims have also spoken out against these grooming gangs. Hello, are we on the same planet here? Are we actually on the same planet here?
A lot of people may have heard through the media frenzy that erupted. We had a historic moment when we heard of the tragic cases of child sexual abuse that came to our town. And it was a very dark town, as somebody that was born in Rotherham and somebody that lived in Rotherham. But we, the British Muslim youth and the community members in Rotherham, we came out quite clearly. We condemned all types of injustice, and the victims, we stood with them. We went out on community conferences, we went out loud and clear, and we stood against criminals, because criminals don't define any race or religion, and they definitely didn't define us. And we went a step further. We went out and we rallied against these racists. We've rallied against these criminals. And I tell you what, you never ever see the EDL, you never ever see Britain's First come out against white groomers. They don't come out against criminals that somehow don't fit their racist agenda. But we came out, not because we had to, not because we needed to, but because our moral high ground showed that we should. And we came out quite clearly on that.
And you tell me that you're speaking out?
Friday is a holy day for Muslims, with hundreds of thousands gathering for the midday prayer. But today, imams at 500 mosques will deliver the same message, speaking out against child abuse.
Grooming young children for sex and exploitation of our children sexually is totally unacceptable. We must do everything possible to protect our children, preserve their dignity and honor, preserve their innocence, and keep them safe in our houses, in our streets and in our neighbourhood.
Senior Muslim clerics in 500 mosques across the UK have given sermons at Friday prayers denouncing the predatory grooming and sexual abuse of children. These sermons follow the convictions of 7 Oxford-based Muslims for paedophilia and a series of horrific sexual offences, resulting in 2 being given extensive jail terms and 5 receiving life imprisonment. These sermons open with a quote from the Quran, which forbids Muslims from sexual indecency, wickedness and oppression. The coordinated effort from the imams, organised by Together Against Grooming, is said to be the largest joint sermon in the UK on record. Islamic scholar and imam Sheikh Ibrahim Mogra, who helped to organise the sermons, said the issue transcends race and religion.
And you tell me that you're speaking out?
They use drugs, they use alcohol, they have sexual intercourse, yes? Okay, now I just want to make this something very clear, yeah? Alcohol is one of the major sins of Islam. No, not just haram, we have major sins, yeah? Alcohol is one of the major sins in Islam.
Even selling it.
Having sex outside of marriage, let alone rape, is one of the major sins in Islam, yeah? Lying is a major sin in Islam. So let me get this right. Islam says you're not allowed to drink alcohol, you are not allowed to rape, you are not allowed to lie, you're not allowed to deceive. Grooming gangs drink alcohol, do drugs, lie and rape. Islam says no, grooming gangs say yes. Is the problem with Islam or the individuals?
This is a reprehensible and evil, despicable behaviour that's got nothing to do with Islam. Number 2, we said that Islam teaches us to be proactive in terms of addressing these 2 particular issues. 3, we have got models and initiatives taking place which are addressing some of the issues which are related to grooming and sexual abuse, such as drug supply, such as working with the gangster lifestyle of some of our youth, such as dealing with the criminal culture which is developing in our community. We need to stop these particular issues.
And you tell me that you're speaking out?
Well, I think the most important step that's happened over recent times is that there's been a recognition that child grooming, exploitation, as a disgusting and heinous crime that it is being recognised as being something that affects all communities of all religions, of all races. And I think it's a really positive step to see the initiative we had last month being launched in Bradford, and the conference we have later on today, where we've got organisations, leaders, civic leaders coming from different parts of society to come together to try and address this.
You're disgusting. You should be ashamed of yourselves. You're animals. What is wrong with you guys? What is wrong with you? Imagine if that was your little sister, your little daughter, your granddaughter or your little niece being passed around from one bloke to another. Imagine that, just being passed around like a piece of meat. How would you feel? How would you flipping feel? You know, if that was me, you know what I'd do to people like you? That is a solution. That is a solution. But you're lucky. We live in England. The laws are soft on people like you. You should be ashamed of yourselves. And brothers, if you find out people like this are doing this stuff in the community, serve them good and proper. Deal with them good and proper and hand them into the old bill straight away. Because they're bringing shame to us. Flipping filthy animals.
That shows that sexual abuse takes place in every single community, and we as Muslims in society are there to protect everyone's children because they are our children. We don't see them as someone else's children. We see them, the same responsibility we have for our children to safeguard and protect them is for any other child in British society. And this is an Islamic obligation, an Islamic imperative, because Islam throughout the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, there are teachings about child protection. And I've actually covered all these particular verses. We talk so much about the protection of the child from violence, from abuse, from exploitation. And this is 14 centuries ago. So we in society need to be at the forefront of child protection and child safeguarding.
Not one member of my Pakistani community have stood outside any court trials where these vile Pakistani Muslim men were tried. Not one member of the Pakistani community. And you tell me that you're speaking out?
The Pakistani Christian is either being disingenuous or is not thinking in a reasonable fashion. In order to condemn a group of criminals and or a criminal action, you don't need to stand outside courts and march around like the xenophobes of the EDL, Britain First, the Football Lads Alliance and the like. You just need to put out a condemnatory statement, that's all. This Christian bloke will not accept Muslim condemnations unless he sees Muslims outside court cases yelling at groomers going in and out of the court for their trials like Tommy Robinson and the Britain First types do. That seems awfully unfair. You don't see sports club members, employees of TV stations, parliamentarians or church members being asked to protest outside courtrooms in order to condemn groomers caught in their midst. Why is he asking for this from Muslims? He seems either totally ignorant or just plainly disingenuous. His attitude, in addition, is reckless because it can further fan the flames of anti-Muslim sentiment and encourage collective blame. This is in fact what the far right are trying to do. The far right misuse these news stories and the victims of these grooming gangs to push their xenophobia and dog whistle Islamophobia to the public domain via their propaganda campaigns against Muslims. Essentially, they see the victims of sexual violence at the hands of grooming gangs of an ethnic background for a far-right political project. That's all they care about, their far-right political project.
There's quite a lot of crossover between the two, isn't there? Between the BNP and the EDL, there's quite a lot of crossover.
Well, I mean, the reality of the situation is the type of narratives that these parties are offering around Islam and around immigration are very similar. Jamie's study has shown that EDL supporters are not just concerned about Islam, they're concerned about immigration more generally. I think a lot of people are concerned about immigration.
Let's not get this confused. These people don't care about the victims of sexual abuse. This is quite easily discernible as they concern themselves exclusively on rapes and sexual assaults, which can be pinned on cultural outsiders, Muslims in this case. These far-right tactics have to be opposed, and they have to be opposed intellectually. They must be condemned.
Muslims grooming. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's your brother Taji Mustafa here. Woke up this morning, Friday, and these two words, Muslims and grooming, I switched on the BBC, the Press Association, it was on the TV, it was all over the place. And I was wondering what's going on here. Why am I hearing this association? You don't feel comfortable as a Muslim hearing your deen connected with something so terrible. It turns out there is this initiative, you may have seen it, Muslim religious leaders to condemn child sex grooming. And that there were going to be some khutbahs in some of the masajids. What do people think about this? I went on Twitter, I went on Facebook, and I put a status update asking for people's thoughts. So what is clear is that people raise the issue of collective guilt. Why should Muslims talk about the issue and play into the existing narrative? There's a popular narrative out there that Muslims and Islam are to blame somehow for this issue, and that we should be careful not to fall into that by our actions, by our words. And I agree with that sentiment. After all, Stewart Hall was a white guy, Jimmy Savile, well-known child abusers who abused numerous people. Nobody's saying that churches have to give sermons, the BBC has to apologize, has to condemn. People say, look, these are the actions of a few people, 2 people, and you can't blame a whole community for it. Likewise, the same with these individuals who happen to be Asian or who happen to be Muslim. You can't blame the Muslim community for it. The majority of abusers are white, and nobody's saying the white community. This is a societal issue. It's not a Muslim issue. So collective blame, we need to be careful of not perpetuating that.
Certainly none of these issues are related to religion, and I think some of the far interest groups like the English Defence League or the BNP that look to try and exploit this to sow division and hate amongst communities, I think that is really, really unhelpful at a time where we need communities to come together.
It happened. We had 14 demonstrations. Week after week, month after month, we had far-right fascists marching down our streets. We had closed our shops. A Muslim community were living in fear. However, as time passed by, this idea came about that every Pakistani, every Asian, every Muslim in Rotherham was now tarnished by this idea of grooming. And hate crime within Rotherham rocketed. It rocketed that I tell you my mother didn't want to go to the town centre. My mother has been shouted at. I myself, live on the BBC, have been shouted at through a car and called a groomer. We've had individuals whose mothers' hijabs have been taken off. We had children in school that have been abused by a teacher. We had a man, a taxi driver, that was put onto life's edge when he was beaten and he was put in intensive care. We had so many cases of Islamophobia that we reached out. We reached out to the local police. We sent through what avenues we could to DCLG, and we said that if we don't deal with this issue and the hate crime that the Muslim community in Rotherham are facing, something horrific will happen. But you know what? Nobody listened to us. Nobody listened to our plea. And then 81-year-old Mohsin Ahmed, an elderly grandfather that had worked and lived in this country all his life, was attacked and murdered by a terrorist for no other reason than being a Muslim. Similarly, how Joe Cox was sadly also murdered by a terrorist, and I think we should call it what it is.
There's always a negative connotation to Pakistanis when they are mentioned in the media, or there's already a certain way that it's looked upon.
The evidence quite clearly states that Pakistanis are no more involved in sexual grooming than any other community.
Well, 83% is...
No, it's not actually. You see, it's about how you look at sexual abuse and sexual violence. If you take a subset of that, which is called localized grooming, and that's a subset of overall sexual abuse. And the vast majority of sexual abuses in the UK, 80% of them are white indigenous males. So let's not forget that. Then there's a particular way it's organised, and my work across the country looks at how the pattern is different from South London, is different from Bradford, is different from Rochdale. But so it's how you look at statistics, and this is where you have a media hysteria and a circus. Because, you know, look at the headlines. You know, at the moment there's 2 groups, footballers and Pakistanis. If they're involved in sexual violence, they'll make front page news. There was obviously the famous case we had Operation Retriever in Derby, where it was a group of Pakistani males who groomed. There was enormous media coverage of that. The equivalent white gang, okay, didn't have any media coverage at all. So therefore there was a disproportionality there. You know, at the moment, obviously monitoring it, there are many, many sexual abuse cases that are currently in courts that are running concurrently. However, the only ones which will reach the media, because it's the brilliant headlines, you know, Pakistanis grooming in Oxford or elsewhere. So I think it's important to guard this. We have to have an evidence-based debate.
There was a really interesting article written by Joseph Harker in The Guardian, I think it was last month, where it was deeply and thickly satirical, where essentially he said, why are we not addressing the problem of grooming within white communities? And some people took it at face value and were offended, but actually he raises a really important point, which is why don't we hear more about the grooming that goes on in Penzance or Portsmouth or in Derby? There are huge cases. Nicola Blackwood, the MP for Oxford, came out recently and said the vast majority of grooming and of sexual exploitation, and let's keep in mind in the UK we have something like 200 sexual abuses against women daily and about 50 of children every single day. We've got an incredibly widespread problem, and it's something that needs to be addressed.
John, do you think that the sort of race issue, the culture issue, has overshadowed the whole of sort of abuse, if you like, in this country, in the way it's been reported and talked about?
It has to some extent. I do think that. Let's be clear, the great majority of child sexual abuse and sexual exploitation is perpetrated by white men. And I think the Home Office Select Committee was right in concluding that there is a certain type of sexual exploitation in street grooming where men of an Asian, Pakistani heritage are disproportionately represented in the perpetration of that offending. But overall, the greatest proportion of this offending is undertaken and perpetrated by white men.
And prove otherwise. Look, I think it's really important to realise if you want to protect children, you don't create stereotypes. Right. We had practitioners here, and they were themselves saying there's lots of different models, but people are not focusing on these models because they fixed on this Pakistani grooming model. Okay, the evidence, the facts, based on numerous inquiries that have been done, have shown that sexual grooming and exploitation, it takes place in all communities. The victims come from all backgrounds, the perpetrators come from all backgrounds. And the chief prosecutor, Nazir Afzal, who's done the review nationally, he says that 80 to 90% of the cases of sexual abuse in the UK are white indigenous males. This is a fact.
That's very different from how
evidence-based fact.
Don't call them Muslim grooming gangs as well, because there's nothing Muslim about them. They're only Muslim by name. You don't call groomers that are caught Christian grooming gangs or atheist grooming gangs, so leave religion out of it. A nonce is a nonce, a pedo is a pedo.
They in no way represent the values of what Islam. They are criminals, and they've got to be dealt with according to the letter of the law.
Finally, I want to highlight something you should all be switched on to. The far right are increasingly using people of ethnic backgrounds to demonize other minorities, mainly Muslims.
When you look at the stats, it's just fucking ethnic minorities are fucking scum.
Mark my words, right? If my Pakistani communities don't get their house in order, they're going to suffer the consequences of their actions. Because at the moment, the British white people have been a tolerant people, patient. Imagine if the English raped girls from our communities, the Pakistani communities. You would have been straight onto the streets, rioting, burning cars. This is your animal instinct. Yet the British white people are a tolerant people. They got patience. They are civilized.
This is a tactic used by the far right so as to shield them from accusations of racism. What they are actually doing is tapping into something that has happened historically. As highlighted by the MP Diane Abbott, more established immigrant communities, ethnic minorities that is really, may well criticise the newer and less established immigrant communities in the West.
The second thing to say, and it's perhaps a slightly lighter thing, but it's important, I represent a constituency which has immigrants from everywhere, from the Caribbean, from West Africa, from Israel, from Vietnam, from South Asia, from Eastern Europe. And I'm afraid it's a characteristic of immigrants that the second to last group of immigrants to enter the country feel they have license to be negative about the latest group. So many Irish people weren't so pleasant about West Indians, many West Indians weren't so pleasant about West Africans, and so on and so on. And I say this not to make a frivolous point, but anti-immigrant forces will stand up and say, oh, we heard, a Jamaican say this, or we heard an Irish person say that. The fact that it is almost a rite of passage for immigrant groups a little further along the road to turn and adopt an anti-immigrant narrative to the newest immigrant groups doesn't mean that the anti-immigrant narrative isn't a racialised narrative.
It's something to watch out for. It's still discrimination regardless of the ethnicity of the person who is being used by the far right. So don't get things confused here. Don't feel reluctant to call them out for it by calling a spade. Just because this person is a Pakistani and he's attacking Muslims using far right narratives does not mean that he's not propagating a racist, Islamophobic, xenophobic narrative.
Paper. It was a Scottish paper, right? They were reporting the Edinburgh March as a far right racist event. So I phoned them up. I phoned them up with the presence of Richard Inman from the Vets that Friday night, and I was straight to them. I said, you need to amend your article. This is wrong. If you don't, then we will take it further. And guess what? It worked, because the next day they didn't even report anything on it. Nothing at all. They didn't say it was a far right event. Didn't report anything on it, because they knew that people like myself and the other Asian guys that spoke there were speakers at the event, so they could no longer call it a racist event. So it works.